Hi, my name's Scott the Miniature Maniac, and today we're getting crispy. We're getting clean AF. We're getting tight.
Which are all great descriptors of Squarespace, this video's sponsor. An all-in-one platform to build a beautiful online presence and run your business. What up, mini family? You might be asking yourself, who the heck are the Hawk Lords? Well, I didn't really know until I began shooting this video. I let my patrons decide which chapter I was going to paint for this episode, and they picked these guys because I hadn't yet explored purple with this series. I dug in straight away with the assembly process. For the most part, this stage is pretty simple. Clip the parts off, clean off any remaining sprue and mold lines with an assortment of tools, and glue the parts together. There are a few tricks to this process, however. On certain surfaces, particularly rounded ones like shoulder pads or knees, etc., I tend to clip the part off with some sprue remaining. I find if I go up against the part, I end up removing a chunk of it with the sprue. To remove the remaining bit, I take an X-Acto knife and cut on an upward angle, working around the part to be removed until I essentially have a tiny pyramid of sprue left. I then sand the rest away, and now my shoulder pad is nice and clean. To make painting easier, I left this model in sub-assemblies. The big shield obscures a lot of the model, as does the knee/holster part and the backpack. I'm shooting for a super clean result, so I don't want these parts obscuring the power armor. Nothing will get in the way of my crisp edge highlights. I would not recommend doing this degree of sub-assembly for an army paint job. If you want a really nice one-off result, then this is worth it. But for an army, it is absolutely not. I tried to keep the pegs for assembly intact, so I drilled into them for my pins. I used a tiny amount of super glue to keep the model adhered to my pins, such that later when I assemble the model, it takes very gentle twisting to remove the part from the paper clip. I attached the main model to a chunk of wood with double-sided tape, and that was the assembly phase complete. To begin the base coating process, I primed the model in gray. I like gray because you can get coverage more easily over it with an airbrush when compared with something like white or black. Once I had a nice even coat of that, I applied the main purple color with my airbrush. The Hawklord scheme is mainly purple with a yellow accent color, some gold elements, and a black aquila. The purple I was shooting for, from what I could tell from online sources, was something of a magenta. I mixed together Nagaroth Night and Screamer Pink in a 1-to-1 ratio to get the color I was after. I then applied this in several thin coats with the airbrush. It's important to do enough coats such that you reach full opacity. For me, I did about 5 thin coats. With an airbrush and a hairdryer, you can knock that out in less than 2 minutes. It's important to reach full opacity because later on, we'll need to use this mixture to fix mistakes we will inevitably make while edge highlighting. And if I don't apply sufficient enough layers, you'll notice a difference between the airbrush purple and the paintbrush purple. Because I had this model in so many sub-assemblies, I was able to airbrush other various parts in Flash Gets Yellow to get a nice even coat of that as well. You may notice something different about how I'm painting this model in comparison to previous episodes of Heavy Metal Marines. This time around, I opted to base coat every part of this model before moving on to shading and highlighting. Typically, I'd finish the power armor first before base coating any other part of the model. Applying all your base coats first has its advantages. You get the messiest parts of the paint job out of the way first so that later, when you're highlighting, there's less potential you'll mess it up with future base coats. You also get to see an approximate end result earlier. With a model like this where the scheme is predetermined, it's not as helpful, but if you are making up your own scheme, base coating all the parts first lets you see what your scheme will mostly look like earlier on in the painting process, meaning you can make adjustments now before you've invested time in the miniature. I painted the various other details in Mournfang Brown and metallic parts in Retributor Gold and Bolt Gun Metal. Yes, I still have a pot, and no, you can't have it. The Aquila and various joint tubular thingies in Abaddon Black, and the cloth in Xandri Dust. I took my time with the process, making sure each had a nice, smooth coat of paint. To achieve the Heavy Metal style, you need to be patient and deliberate. The next step we'll do is shading, which will start to carve out a lot of the detail of our Blade Guard veteran. The majority of shading on our Heavy Metal Space Marine is exclusively panel lining. That is, very thin, dark lines that run along the recess of each detail. To spice things up, I tried a different product for some of my panel lining. Recently, I was watching a video on the new Cult of Paint YouTube channel, and Henry suggested using contrast paints for panel lining, so I gave it a try. For comparison, I did the backpack in what I normally use, which is a black paint mixed with a black ink. The contrast paint was a lot more forgiving to use because it tends to sink into the recesses naturally. However, I found that the black paint and ink mixture created more of an obvious result while also not being as forgiving when making mistakes. No one method is correct. It depends on what you're doing and what you prefer, but I'll personally be considering contrast paints more in the future for recess shading. And by the future, I mean right now. I use Wildwood contrast paints to panel line the gold, but it wasn't the greatest for recesses that weren't super pronounced like the details on the shield. So for parts like that, I resorted to using Rhinox Hide, a normal acrylic paint. For the yellow, I learned my lesson from the Imperial Fist episode and used Mournfang Brown as opposed to something darker. Using something darker means that it's significantly harder to fix your mistakes with Flash Gets Yellow, which is about the worst paint when it comes to coverage, and it's not solely because it's yellow. There are plenty of good yellows. This one is just total balls. Model kit painters are screaming at their monitor right now and angrily typing comments about enamel or oil panel liners, but you guys gotta understand. People who paint Space Marines are scared of products that don't say Games Workshop on them, and we're breaking out Tamiya Clears later, so I don't want to freak anyone out. One thing at a time. Everything gets a recessed shade other than the cloth because Xandri Dust will end up being our darkest color. Now, I often crap on Heavy Metal for sticking to the tried and true methods they always use, but they often branch out, and a perfect example of that is on the box art for the shield trim. You can see that in the corners of the gold, it gets darker, so let's try to replicate that. Using an old chestnut ink from GW, yes, I still have a pot, and no, you can't have it, I glazed toward each corner from both sides in several passes, allowing the ink to dry in between each step. Each step I'm also covering less and less of the gold trim so I develop a transition. You could do this with normal paint, contrast paint, and even shades and get similar results. If you need help with glazing and many of the other techniques that I mentioned in this video, check out the description. I'll have videos linked there that deep dive into specific techniques so you can get the full story. Chestnut ink wasn't really dark enough to replicate the exact effect from the box art, so I popped on a little brown ink in the very corner to pump up the jams. Pump up the jams! Pump them up! With that complete, that should finish up the shading of this miniature. Now we're on to the step that makes this Marine really pop and look like an Heavy Metal Marine. Highlighting. Most of the highlighting in this step is edge highlighting. For the power armor, we'll do 3 separate edge highlights. I take my original purple armor mixture, and to it I add white and ice blue in incrementally increasing amounts to get my 3 edge highlight colors. I absolutely love highlighting purple with a turquoise or a light blue color. It gives it a really cool look. For your first pass of edge highlights, make sure the line is wide enough such that you can fit another line wholly within this first one without covering it all up in the next step. Just like with recessed shading, edge highlighting benefits from paint that is thin enough such that it flows off your brush nicely while not being so thin that it requires multiple passes to get opacity. You don't want to be redoing edge highlights multiple times with the same color if you can avoid it. For this reason, I typically use opaque inks to mix my edge highlights because they're thin while still partially opaque. But again, Liquitex scary big time.
Liquitex? That's not even a hobby brand.
I just stuck to normal acrylic paints and honestly, it gets the job done just fine. For the last purple edge highlight, I focused mainly on the corners and sharp points and not every single edge. While I finish that, let me tell you about today's sponsor, and that's Squarespace. I don't have a personal gallery for my miniature painting art, so when Squarespace reached out to me to sponsor my video, I took it as an opportunity to use their platform to build a dedicated gallery for myself. For those who don't know what miniature painting is, which is like all of my family, this shows them in a succinct way. Importing images and dealing with alignment is made easy, and all while creating a website that just looks awesome. It's important that your galleries show your work while also being functional and beautiful itself. If I need to see a bigger resolution of this mini so I can see the crispy edges, it's as simple as clicking on the image. If you want to set up a nice miniature art gallery for yourself, head to squarespace.com/Miniac to save 10% off your first purchase of a website or domain using the code Miniac. Alright, back to painting. For the yellow, I only did 2 edge highlights. I know, I'm slacking hard. Yellow is so bright a color that in my opinion, it doesn't really benefit much from so many edge highlights. You just can't see them all. I used a 3-to-1 mixture of Screaming Skull and Flash Skits Yellow and a pure white for my final edge highlight, following the same guiding principles as on the purple. For the gold, I used Liberator Golds for my first pass and Speed Metal from Scale 75 for my last pass. With this same silver, I also edge highlighted the silver parts. I find that with metallics, the edge highlights aren't as crucial as for the other parts like purple and yellow, because due to their natural reflectivity, the edges already look bright and shiny. Also, while I had this silver out, I went around to all the tiny little bolts and gave them a quick base coat. Paying attention to little details like these really elevates your end result. Now, onto the black Aquila, which is simply 2 edge highlights of a middle gray and a brighter gray that I mixed from Abaddon black and white. Part of the beauty of this painting style is that it's incredibly easy to follow, but technically difficult to master. There aren't many tricks, deviations, or experimentation. That isn't a knock on the box artists either. They're painting this way because that's what GW wants, and it's consistently good. Finally, for the leather, I simply mixed more and more Screaming Skull into my Mournfang Brown to get 2 edge highlights. For me, mixing my edge highlights with paint I already have on my palette is a lot easier than getting out more paint. I already have everything I need in front of me, and standing up is tough. On to the last bit of highlighting, and we're going to do actually something other than edge highlighting. We're going to work up highlights in multiple thin layers. Remember that phrase, multiple thin layers. With Xandri Dust, I'll mix in some Screaming Skull and begin my highlighting, focusing on pretty much every part that isn't a deep recess. I'm not necessarily looking for full opacity with each coat of paint. The translucency of acrylic paint plus the technique of layering allows us to build up a transition with no active blending like wet blending or glazing. For future layers where I mix in more Screaming Skull and now some white, I'm targeting the majority of it on the lower part of his abdomen that billows out and the upper part of his waist area, following the same principles as outlined before. Thin layers. Every part of this process requires patience, so take your time and slowly build up a blend with thin layers of progressively whiter and whiter paint. Alright, on to the last painting stage, some freehand. Despite Hawklords being a successor chapter of the Ultramarines, their chapter icon is a yellow Raven Guard logo, which should be stupid hard to do, but the Indomitus box didn't come with any Raven Guard decals, and I'm a tryhard. Again, I have a whole video about freehanding, but I'll highlight the basic steps here. I'm tracing out the simple shapes of the bird, trying to get the proportions, the size, and the location right. I'm using a purple tone here because it's an easier color than pure white to correct mistakes, and it also reaches opacity faster than white. Once the basic shape is sussed out, I use the purple power armor color to refine the shape, cutting in details like the gap in between the feathers or the scooped out area where the head goes. I go back and forth with my two purple colors until I got the image that I want. I didn't nail it on the first try, and in fact I very rarely nail anything I do on the first try. It requires lots of back and forth, so expect it. Once the shape is correct, I'll fill it in with white and then yellow. The intermediate white layer is required because again, Flash gets yellow as total balls. I did 2 other janky freehands on this guy which really helped flesh him out. Because we aren't doing any traditional highlighting on him, there are large areas of purple that seem unfinished in my opinion. So filling them in with some detail helps make the paint job seem more complete. With that done, I put together the model, and now we can move on to the final and most fun stage. Hawklords are known for their aerial maneuvers, so I figured we could have our guy on an airstrip of some kind with lines and lights and whatnot. First step was to dig through the bit bins to find some cool things, like this gas canister, which I converted into a Space Marine gas canister with the addition of this little symbol thingy, which I'm sure has a name, and I'm sure I'll discover from a comment on this video from a snarky Space Marine fanboy. Bits are a great way to flesh out your display base and give them some extra life. To give the ground some texture, I used this special styrene from Plastruct and cut out a disc the same diameter as my plinth. I sanded the top to improve adhesion and make sure it was flat and glued on my cool stamped metal texture with some super glue. Once that was on there, I used some plastic cement and glued on the Space Marine Go-Go Juice canister. The last bit of construction was to drill some holes that will take our runway lights. I drew a line with a ruler and then marked out every 5mm to drill a hole and then drilled those holes. I gave the base a quick prime and then started the painting process with some dry brushing. This is actually a perfect application of dry brushing because the detail on this base is too fine for a wash to render it correctly. The 2 stages of dry brushing bring it out very nicely. Next up, I wanted to add some runway lines, so I taped off a section of the base and sponged on some white paint. I saw this method on a Luke Towan video, and it's a great way for getting a rougher line like I'd imagine one would have on a runway where there have been years of abuse of Thunderhawks taking off and landing. Next, I added some thick puddles of Tamiya clear orange to act as greasy oil, and for a last bit of wear and tear to the ground, I added some black pigment and some brown pigments for some extra dirt or soot for some engine exhaust. I gave the canister a quick paint job, and then I got onto the fun runway lights. I stuck in a clear acrylic rod and snipped it off at approximately the same height for each hole. I then took a flat metal file and brought them all to the same height. I then took some Tamiya clear green, which doesn't look green at all when applied in this way, and painted it onto each rod. I think that this is actually the intended purpose of this product. It tinted the clear acrylic perfectly, allowing it to look still translucent. With the completion of that last detail, it was time to remove the tape from the base, stick the model on, and our Hawklord Marine is finally complete. I'm really pleased with this end result. This is definitely one of my cleaner Marines. While it was cool to do this scheme, I can't help but think of the Vikings football team whenever I look at it. Something like Soul Drinkers would have been more up my alley if I wanted to explore purple without being reminded of sports every 5 seconds. This was episode 9 of Heavy Metal Marines, which means there's one more episode left before I retire this series for good, and I got something special in mind for it. Thanks for watching my video all the way to the end. It means a lot to me. If you like the channel and you want to support it, there are a number of ways you can do it, namely some merch like this generic Spaceman decapitation shirt, or I make a model that you can buy along with a digital course that teaches you how to paint that model, or other things like Patreon and Amazon affiliate things, all linked in the description below. Subscribe or die! And most importantly, don't forget to paint more memories!